Now, it's almost 70 years since the first wave of Afro-Caribbean immigrants landed on these shores, around 50 since folks started arriving in great numbers from the subcontinent, and recent years have seen a huge influx from Western, then Eastern Europe. The migration has hardly been without its problems and controversy, and for parts of the country, it's involved a huge transformation. But these days, we tend to think of ourselves as a changed country, but rubbing along together. An official audit of race published this week confirmed what most suspected. We might have come a long way from the 1950s, but we still have a long way to go when it comes to equal opportunities. But is it worse than that? At core, are we still a deeply racist society? Here's model, DJ and social activist Munroe Bergdorf with her take of the week.
What kind of country is modern Britain? No doubt it's a country that likes to think of itself as inclusive, but that depends where you're standing. To me, as a transgender mixed-race person, we live in a deeply racist society. The government's race audit for England identified discrimination against people of colour in many of our institutions, ranging from the police to the justice system to schools. Does this surprise you? It's old news to me and almost a bad joke to identify it now. It's something that we've known for years, but the political will has not been there to deal with it, and I'm not sure it is now. Why should we expect anything else from a country that's built its success on the enslavement of non-white people? It's that continuous cycle of racism that explains where we are now. Why does the UK acknowledge the sacrifice of people killed in wars, but not the spilled blood of black people? If the UK took our oppression seriously, then people like me who call out racism would be listened to, rather than ridiculed or threatened with death. If white people want to see an improvement for people of colour, they need to understand that racism is not learned, it's inherited, and either consciously or unconsciously passed down through privilege. The uncomfortable truth is that the white race is the most violent and oppressive force of nature on Earth. My worry is that whatever governments do to tinker with institutional racism, it is so ingrained in the fabric of British society that it is too late to do anything about it.
And from the World Cinema in Herne Hill to our own little cinema here in SW1, Munroe joins us now. Thanks for joining us and for your take. Michael, do you agree? Is Britain a deeply racist society?
I hadn't thought so. I don't think I've thought about things as deeply and carefully as Munroe has, perhaps, but I didn't think it was deeply institutionally racist. I thought the point that you made in the film, which absolutely does echo, is the historic point that, if you take the United States, it's built on the suppression of the African American, the Native American, and many immigrant classes, and our society built a lot of its wealth on slavery. But whereas when I go to the United States, I feel that that has left the most tremendous legacy, which is highly relevant today, I somehow don't get the same feeling in this country about the relevance. I mean, your appreciation of the relevance will be different from mine.
Of course, because it's my lived experience and you would never have experienced racism yourself. But I don't think that it's helpful to compare nations. I don't think that, racism in Australia is different to racism in the UK, but comparing different racisms between different nations isn't really helpful. I think our racism is insidious and we don't talk about it, and we're not confronted with it in police shooting down people in the street. We don't have that explicitness that America has. It's very behind closed doors, and we're very British about our racism. So that's probably why you haven't felt it.
But you noticed in the figures as well that,
yes,
that one of the groups that was very disadvantaged in this, sorry, I'm falling into the language, one of the groups that performed very poorly, whether they were disadvantaged or not is an open question, was the white working class boy.
Yes.
I mean, they came almost below any category in the entire list. Now, that isn't racism, presumably, is it? There's a social problem there. So
that's class.
But so but what I'm suggesting is that you're making a leap from what emerged in these figures to saying that the cause must be victimisation, victimhood, must be racist, whereas some of the elements clearly were not racist. There are problems there which aren't.
I don't think the inquiry was just on race. I think it's intersections. So you've got intersections of race and class, which do often meet. So I don't necessarily think that we can always just kind of pick bits and bobs out. We need to look at the whole thing.
Ed, are we a deeply racist society?
I think the thing I didn't agree with in the film was the pessimism at the end, that it's too late, that it's inevitable. But I think the reality is that the figures should challenge every institution to try and answer that question for itself in a proactive way. The reality is, you can say, but actually, look, it's also about poverty, it's also about where you live. But in the end, those become excuses, because it's also the case that it's harder to get on and succeed because of the colour of your skin in our country. And I think the powerful argument you make is that simply, if you are in an institution, whether that's the board of directors or a police chief constable, it's not enough to say, I'm not racist.
Yes.
You have to prove that in the actions you take every day as an institution, because unless you're on the front foot and actually doing something about it, the status quo is not a fair status quo on racial terms. And so therefore, but surely if we are proactive, it's not
we're not proactive.
Yeah,
that's what I was talking about.
But it's not inevitable.
I'm yet to see it. And we live in a society where we won't even talk about it. So until we actually we've only just really started talking about modern day racism. When we talk about racism, we're always, either talking, sorry to bring up what you talked about, but we're either comparing to America, which is wholly, wholly different. The history is very, very different. We celebrate the empire here, but the empire has a horrible history for people of colour. But we have a multicultural society. So there's this imbalance, and especially when it comes to education, the whole system needs to change.
Let me look at education. Let's look at the figures on education. 33% of white kids go to university or further education. 37% of black kids go to university or further education. 67% of Indian kids go to university or further education. 76% of Chinese kids go to university or further education. Where's the racism in that?
I'm talking about how people's history and how people's
But I'm talking about now and the chances of young children.
I'm not talking about their...
But what's wrong with these figures?
I'm about to tell you. I'm not talking about their academic performance. I'm talking about how we are taught about each other. If black kids aren't being taught about their histories, if we're being taught, that white history is paramount, that's essentially feeding into a white supremacist narrative. We can't be teaching kids that white is the default, that white people's history is the sole history of this country. We need to be taught about black contributions and other contributions of other cultures within society.
But for most people, what racism is and what they'd like to improve is the chances of people getting on regardless of the colour of your skin.
That's not just racism, though. I'm talking about the mental health.
But it's still quite an important thing. And these figures would suggest that as a country, we're doing reasonably well.
No, that's facts and figures.
But you think, facts and figures are important. But you think
I think it goes deeper
that we are irredeemably racist, don't you?
What, this society?
Quite
yeah, I do. I do. Unfortunately, I do. I think that the success of Britain is literally based on racism.
And do you think we're irredeemably sexist as well?
100%.
But if you take something like gender,
I think
we are making advances in terms of gender pay.
All men smashing down the patriarchy, we are going to be on that page. So I think, yes,
but we can make progress.
I think we can make progress and we can combat it.
But if it's irredeemable, you can't make progress.
I mean, it's fighting human nature, and humans are flawed.
Humans are flawed, but you seem to think that white people are uniquely evil.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that individual people are unique.
Well,
I'm talking about society.
No. You said whites are the most violent and oppressive people.
Well, yes.
That's what you said in your film.
And if you're going to go back
So
to
that would seem to me
then statistics point that out too.
Really? Well,
Yes.
the Chinese were massacring Chinese and other races long before they'd ever met a white person. Attila the Hun wasn't white. It's the same in the subcontinent if you go back hundreds of years as well. The genocide in Rwanda was black on black.
Probably
So is the
West.
Congo, which is the rape capital of the world. These things have got nothing to do with white people.
Okay. And I feel like this situation where I'm sat on a couch trying to justify my feelings towards racism and trying to justify why we're in this situation with the findings of the government. Facts and figures of people going to university is not reflective of the mental health of people of colour. It's not reflective of how people of colour are taught about their own histories, taught about the progress and where we come from. That is not reflective, and that is not indicative, that what you've got in front of you, that is not indicative of a fair state of affairs within this society.
But do you think, on the other hand, that if a lesson that emerges from all of this
Yes.
is that people of colour are victims in some way, do you not see dangers in that? Do you not see that people may just believe the whole thing is so stacked against them that they have an excuse for not doing as well as they might?
Are you saying the race card?
I've expressed myself in my own way. I mean, you obviously, have a very clear impression of prejudice.
Yes.
We've gone through the figures which Andrew has produced, which don't actually, in this instance,
I don't
anyway,
think that black people use racism as an excuse at all, no.
But, if we're going to be taught things,
Yes.
we ought to be taught everything.
Yes.
And one of the things we ought to be taught are what those figures actually show.
But if you take the senior civil service
So
or
what was the question before?
Well, I wasn't really asking you a question. I was
Okay.
just saying, if you believe that things should be taught,
Yes.
then the figures that have come out here, which didn't demonstrate what we thought they might demonstrate, are also something that people ought to understand. In other words, if there are black people there saying, I've no hope of going to university, well, no, go to the figures and find out that actually your chances of going to university are not as good as an Indian kid, but they're better than a white kid. I
don't think that you're looking at the details. I don't think that you're looking at what a person of colour experiences in that time of going to school and going to university. Yes, they may go to university, but what is their experience within that school structure? What is their experience within the education system? My self-worth and my low self-worth by the time that I got to university was largely because of my experience in the education system and how my well-being was put to a side and overlooked in favour of the white students. And my histories and my role models just weren't there. My sex education was not there. My looking into gender was not there. Everything that would be of empowering, a source of empowerment for myself was not there. I did not feel supported with the education system. Yes, I went to university too, but I really did not benefit from my high school experience.
Can anything be done?
Yes, and it did sound quite futile on the film, but I do feel like we all need to be on the same page in how we combat this. And I don't feel like white people should be so defensive when it comes to talking about racism. It is a very tough situation and tough subject for everybody to talk about. But really, we need to just bear in mind that it doesn't affect white people.
But the answer is that white people have to do things.
Yes.
It's not simply... And
I think that's what the problem is, really.
But you don't have to be, as a white person, you might not be violent or oppressive. You might just be ignorant.
Yeah.
And actually, there were the figures you quoted there, but if you look at the senior echelons of business or the civil service, there's gross underrepresentation of black people. The question is, are white people at the top of those organisations every day saying, what are we doing about it? But unless they are, you won't combat it.
We're going to have to...
But they're not so futile about it. And I think that's why so many black people feel so futile about it. And I don't think
could
that...
do it.
We could, but it's a very big could.
Yep. Except 85% of whites in this country feel they belong to Britain. 84% of Asians. 81% of black people. it's not clear that non-white people in this country feel the way you do.
I do feel like I'm part of Britain. I do.
You do?
Yeah, of course I do.
Despite it being irredeemably racist?
Of course. I mean, there's Black Britain, and you know, there's Black culture within cultures. My Britain is very different to what a white person would have experienced. It doesn't mean that I don't love this country for the opportunities that it's given me. I feel very fortunate in some ways to live in Britain.
Okay.
But I'm also not a fan of the insidious culture that we have here, that we can't talk about racism and that we don't understand what racism is.
We've talked about tonight on Network Television. Munroe, thank you.
Thank you.